ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxing. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxing. So one heartbeat consists of diastole and systole. Atria contract, then ventricles contract. Go ahead.
It's a little off topic, but the football player that got hit, that what part of the cardiac cycle do you think he was at?
I believe it's when the SA node is sending its signal. And that signal got interrupted. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think that's when it is. Yeah, and it stopped the signal from being sent. Okay, we okay with this terminology? Okay, another term I will use for cardiac autoconduction is intrinsic control of heart rate. You guys know the terms intrinsic and extrinsic? Something that's intrinsic is internal. Something that's extrinsic is external. So intrinsic control is something that controls itself. Extrinsic control is something that's controlled externally. So autoconduction is intrinsic. That's the heart controlling itself. If something else is acting on the SA node to speed it up or slow it down, that will be extrinsic control. Okay, so the heart controlling itself, setting the rhythm to 100 beats per minute, that's intrinsic control of heart rate. Cardiac autoconduction. Now we've got to talk about extrinsic control of heart rate. So this is when something external is acting on the SA node to either speed it up or slow it down. So this is either going to be through the parasympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system. So I mentioned these a while ago, way back in chapter 3, when we were first talking about sensory motor integration, and I drew that diagram, and I said our muscle contractions are going through the somatic system, which splits off into the autonomic system, which is involuntary, and the autonomic system splits off into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's where we are right now. So this is involuntary control. Parasympathetic nervous system is in charge when you're resting. So when it's active, it's going to slow everything down. Sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight system. So in emergency situations, that's the one that gives you the adrenaline dump that prepares you to either fight or flee, which also is active during exercise. Just instead of giving you the dump of adrenaline, it gives you secretions, and we call it epinephrine instead of adrenaline, but it's the same thing. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system is active when you're exercising, and it's going to help you exercise. So, for heart rate, they both have ways of acting on the SA node. The parasympathetic system uses the vagus nerve. It's a parasympathetic nerve. So when the vagus nerve acts on the SA node, it's going to slow it down. It's going to slow your heart rate down below 100 beats per minute. So the more active your parasympathetic nervous system is, the lower your resting heart rate is. When the vagus nerve is very active, we call that high vagal tone. High vagal tone will mean you have a low heart rate. It will lower your heart rate. Sympathetic nervous system will act on the SA node through the sympathetic cardiac nerve. So the sympathetic cardiac nerve will act on the SA node. And when that nerve is active, it's going to increase your heart rate above 100 beats per minute. And then we will have the secretion of epinephrine, which will also act on the SA node to increase your heart rate above 100 beats per minute. Okay, so we have three things that act on the SA node for extrinsic control. So if we look at this heart rate as a continuum, our low heart rate's not gonna be 0. What's it gonna be? What's a normal resting heart rate?
60.
Normal range will be 60 to 100 beats per minute. So a more fit person is going to be in the lower end of that, 60 to 80. A less fit person is gonna be the higher end of that, 80 to 100. Anything 60 to 100 is considered normal. So I'm gonna put 60 beats per minute here as our low. I'm gonna put 200 beats per minute here as our high. That depends on your age. Most of you in your low 20s, so it's gonna be right around 200. 100 beats per minute is right here. What's the significance of 100 beats per minute?
Natural sinus rhythm.
Natural sinus rhythm. So if your heart rate goes down to 60, what's causing that? Okay, it's an increase in parasympathetic nervous system activity, specifically an increase in vagal tone that's going to decrease your heart rate below 100 beats per minute. If we increase our heart rate above 100 beats per minute, what's causing that? Increased sympathetic nervous system activity, specifically through the sympathetic cardiac nerve and epinephrine. Okay, if we look at this in a more practical situation, you're sitting in your chair, or you're standing on the treadmill, but you haven't started moving it yet. So your heart rate is as low as it can go, 60 or whatever your resting heart rate is. You start walking on the treadmill, then you start walking faster, then you start speed walking, then you start jogging. Your heart rate's gonna increase towards 100. What is causing that?
Increase of intensity.
So the decrease
But what's
in parasympathetic-
physiologically, what's acting on the SA node? Okay, so think about it this way. Anything below 100 beats per minute is modulated by the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system's not going to kick in really until you get to 100. So the sympathetic nervous system is not going to increase your heart rate from 60 to 100.
Parasympathetic lack of influence.
Parasympathetic system is going to have less activation. So if you're resting, that's when your parasympathetic system is most active. Your heart rate is lowest. If you start moving around, your parasympathetic system is going to withdraw. Okay, so this is a decrease in parasympathetic nervous system activity, specifically decreased vagal tone. If you decrease your vagal tone, that means you're sending fewer signals through your vagus nerve. That allows your heart rate to increase towards its natural sinus rhythm. Does that make sense? Okay, now if you're running and your heart rate's up here at 140, and you decide you're done and you slow down 8 miles per hour, 7 miles per hour, 6 miles per hour, your heart rate's going to decrease towards 100. What is causing that? Decreased sympathetic nervous system activity. So you have fewer signals through the sympathetic cardiac nerve and less secretion of epinephrine, which will allow your heart rate to decrease towards its natural sinus rhythm. Okay, same information in a different format. This is still extrinsic control of heart rate. So on the x-axis, I'm going to put intensity, low, medium, high. Y-axis, I'm going to put heart rate in beats per minute. Our low is going to be 60. Our high is going to be 200. 100 beats per minute right here. What's the significance of 100 beats per minute?
Natural sinus rhythm.
So, starting at rest, heart rate is as low as it can go. We increase our intensity a little bit, our heart rate increases a little bit. We increase our intensity a little bit, heart rate increases a little bit. So it's a linear relationship like this. Increases in heart rate between 60 and 100 beats per minute are due to what?
Parasympathetic nervous system.
Yes, what's the parasympathetic? Yeah. So it's not enough to say parasympathetic nervous system. We have to say decreased parasympathetic nervous system activity. Specifically,
The vagal tone.
decreased vagal tone. Increases in heart rate above 100 beats per minute due to
Sympathetic nervous system.
increased sympathetic nervous system activity through sympathetic cardiac nerve and epinephrine. Okay, so if I were to give you an example, like Jaime is sitting in his chair, he gets up, he starts walking, then he starts walking faster, then he starts jogging, then he starts running, then he starts sprinting. What is happening to his heart rate and why? You can't just say his heart rate is increasing because he needs to pump more blood to his muscles. Okay, this is a physiology class. You need to explain the physiological mechanism behind the increase in heart rate. Okay, from 60 to 100, it's because of a decreased parasympathetic activity. Over 100, it's because of increased sympathetic activity. Give details. Are we okay with that? Go ahead.
If you said like, from the 60 to 100, would you say it's going, like, increasing to natural sinus rhythm before the sympathetic kicks in? Would that work too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but give the details of the vagal tone.
Yeah,
Yes. And actually, you can get an anticipatory release of epinephrine. Like, if you know you're about to go work out after this class, you can start getting a release of epinephrine before you go in anticipation. So it's not black and white. Nothing in your body is black and white. So it's not for sure that the sympathetic system doesn't kick in until 100 beats per minute. But that's in general. All right, I'm going to give you a bunch more terminology now. There's a lot of terminology in this chapter. Oh, I forgot to say, back on this drawing of the vessels, the arterioles are the ones that have the muscular walls, smooth muscles in your vessels that can vasodilate and vasoconstrict. So that's how we control blood flow. If we want more blood flow going to this muscle, we vasodilate this arteriole and it gets wider. If we want less blood flow to this muscle, we vasoconstrict and it gets narrower. Those muscles are in the arterioles. We're going to come back to that later. Okay, heart rate. Again, one of those terms, you know what it means when I say it, but how do you define it? You think of a way to define heart rate?
Beats per minute.
Yeah, look at the unit. It's the number of times the heart beats in a minute. So it's in beats per minute. Number of times the heart beats in a minute. What controls the heart rate?
The SA node.
The SA node. So we call that the effector. The SA node controls the heart rate. So if we want to talk about something increasing or decreasing the heart rate, we have to talk about it having a conversation with the SA node. SA node's in control. Stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. So we're mostly concerned with the blood that's coming out of the left ventricle because that's what's delivering blood to the body. So this stroke refers to just one contraction. Amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. The effector for that is the left ventricular myocardium. Myo means muscle, cardium means heart. So the muscular wall of the left ventricle controls the stroke volume. The more forcefully that muscle contracts, the more blood is going to come out. The formula for stroke volume EDV stands for end diastolic volume. Yep. Someone call? End diastolic volume. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. The amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. What is the ventricle doing during diastole? Contracting or relaxing?
Relaxing.
It is relaxing, so it's filling. So at the end of diastole, the ventricle should be full. ESV stands for end systolic volume. End systolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of systole. End systolic volume, the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of systole. What is the ventricle doing during systole? Contracting and emptying. So at the end of systole, that ventricle should be empty. It never completely empties, there's always a little bit left in, but we want that number to be low. We want to get out as much as possible. So if we think about it this way, if I have a glass that has some water in it, let's say it has 100 milliliters of water in it. I pour some of it out into a different cup. And then my original cup now has 40 milliliters of water in it. Can you figure out how much I poured out? How did you figure that out? You did 100 minus 40. Okay, you just knew intuitively to do that. If this glass is our left ventricle, this is the amount of blood in the ventricle when it's full. What do we call that? This is the amount of blood in the ventricle after we empty it. What do you call that? So if we do the amount of blood in the ventricle when it's full minus the amount of blood in the ventricle when it's empty, it tells us how much came out. So stroke volume equals end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Questions? Okay, next is cardiac output. Cardiac output is abbreviated Q. I don't know why. The dot on top means per minute. Just like when I write VO2, I put a dot on top because that's always expressed per minute. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per minute. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per minute. We can figure out how much blood is pumped per minute if we know how many times in a minute the heart beats, which is heart rate, and how much blood comes out with each contraction, which is stroke volume. So cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Go ahead.
What are we using for this one, for cardiac output?
It'll usually be in liters per minute, yeah. Ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is what percent of the blood was pumped out in one contraction. What percent of the blood was pumped out in one contraction? That's different than what amount of blood was pumped out in one contraction. For example, if we look at my drawing here of the glasses, what amount of water was poured out? 60 milliliters. What percent of water was poured out?
60%.
Okay, so that's easy because it's out of 100. What if I make this out of 210 milliliters? That'll change this, but it doesn't matter. Now, what's the amount of water that I poured out? Still 60 milliliters. What's the percentage of water that I poured out? How do you figure that out? What math do you do? Someone do that math? What's it come out to be?
28.57%.
Okay, so it comes out to be 0.285, so we'll say 29%. Okay, so what did we do here? We did stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. That's how you figure out the percent. The amount you poured out divided by the amount that was available. It's going to give you the percent. Just like on your exam, if I say you scored 110 points and it was worth 143, how do you figure out your percent? The number of points you scored divided by the number of points that were available. Right? You guys need to be able to work with percents like that. So ejection fraction is what percent of the blood was pumped out in one contraction. So ejection fraction equals stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume, and it's going to be times 100 to make it a percent. I'm going to erase cardiac autoconduction. Is that okay? Anybody need a photo? You good? Yep.
Would it mean that if we also have, if we have the stroke volume and the heart rate and the VO2, we could find out more accurately like what's going on in the body, like physiologically, like if they're burning more or something else?
That's not really going to have anything to do with the energy expenditure.
No?
Blood pressure.